I'll never forget the first time I saw Earthworm Jim way back in the day. I was watching a video game TV show and someone was talking about this crazy new game which had just been released on either the Super Nintendo or the Mega Drive, I forget. But I couldn't believe my eyes because the animation, characters and graphics were just so appealing and looked completely awesome. I didn't manage to get the game for a few months, but after getting some cash for my birthday that year, a guy in my school told me that he had a copy for sale cheap on the Super Nintendo. You see, his dad was a journalist for the local school newspaper, and so his dad would buy him copies of the game and he wanted him to review them and then put the reviews in the newspaper. Once he'd done this, his son would just basically sell on the copy of the game. But his loss was my gain, because when I picked it up from him, I remember putting a whole ton of hours into the game and enjoying it a lot. Fast forward to 1999 and finally the first 3D Earthworm Jim game was released. I say finally because this almost became one of those games which never arrived. It was announced so early in the console's lifetime that it almost began to become a Duke Nukem Forever style joke that the game was ever going to be released, and it was hotly tipped to become vaporware. Shortly after the release of Earthworm Jim 2, its developer Shiny Entertainment was purchased by Interplay. The entire studio was put onto other projects, and the Earthworm Jim franchise was given to VIS Entertainment, and the decision was made to take Jim from 2D into 3D. And at that time, nobody would have ever expected a 3-year development cycle for this game. Problems quickly arose, and what ended up being released was a hashed-together platform game, which none of the cool original features had been promised were eventually delivered. We were told, and in some cases shown, that the game would have more levels, some vehicle-based missions, a bigger cast of characters and so much more. As the game went through so many builds and variations, even the media of the time lost track with what they were being given to show, as each time they received a new build to either preview or eventually review, it was almost unrecognisable from the last version they had received. The original series designer Doug Perry had sold the rights to Earthworm Jim. Although he was on the development team as a consultant early on, he was eventually dismissed from his position, and this leads to a lot of fans not to consider this a true entry in the series, as even the creator himself said that he hated what they did in this game and to the character. Thankfully though, we did at least get an N64 version, as the PlayStation version of the game was cancelled, and so landing on store shelves in 1999 came Earthworm Jim 3D. Developed by VIS Entertainment and published by Interplay in Europe and Rockstar Games in North America. Now if you're a fan of the previous games or indeed the TV show, you'll be pleased to know that the plot in this game is as weird and wonderful as expected. Earthworm Jim is hit by a flying cow which sends him into a coma. Whilst he's in the coma, Jim gains consciousness but he is trapped inside his mind, and he finds out that he has gone completely insane. His previous enemies have taken over, and if Jim doesn't do something quick, he will be insane forever. To restore his sanity, he must find golden udders from the different realms of his mind which have been taken over. This is actually a pretty cool plot, I felt. Given the nature of entering areas of Jim's mind gave it the studio the ability to create something interesting in terms of the worlds, which perhaps would not have traditionally fit into the Earthworm Jim universe. Jim's skull acts as the main hub world, and this splits into fantasy, fear, memories and happiness. This is much more interesting than the traditional platform game tropes of earth, fire, snow and so on. And to be honest, I would have expected nothing less from the studio with this franchise at their disposal. Entering each of the worlds, you'll quickly realise that whilst in-game, this is pretty much a run-of-the-mill 3D platformer. You'll traverse wide open levels, have enemies to take out, puzzles to solve, and of course what N64 game would be complete without a ton of collectibles. You'll also have a host of moves to help you work your way through the levels, and you'll progress and naturally learn more as you work your way deeper into Jim's mind. I personally found the controls to be very tight and responsive, but this is hampered significantly by the game's camera. Simply put, it's not that great, and you have to spend a lot of time mashing the C buttons trying to get the camera into a comfortable position. The passive camera does a fairly okay job most of the time when you're in wider open areas, but as you move through the game and into some more confined sub-areas, everything becomes a twitchy mess. However, if you're playing this for the first time now, you'll perhaps be more used to the same kind of camera issues that you find in many N64 platform games. And whilst it was a bigger annoyance as a kid, it's something that you've probably learned to live by these days. The level design itself is varied, and it's hard to find anything to knock in this department. Each world does feel genuinely unique, with different enemies, scenery and submissions which help to extend what could have otherwise been a fairly short game to complete. Nothing you're expected to do feels like it's intentionally wasting your time, and the amount of collectibles are kept fairly slim, which helps a lot with the game's pacing. The number of weapons is also quite cool, and each level tends to have its own special weapon that relates directly to the zone you're in. For example, in the farmyard-like levels, you'll get an egg gun, and in the Wild West you'll get a nice 6-shot revolver. There's also special items such as boost canisters which allow Jim to fart and shoot upwards, and balloons which inflate Jim and allow you plenty of time to float around the level. And explore the levels you will, because even to my surprise the overall presentation is really well done. Okay, sure, you're not going to be getting Nintendo or Rare levels of quality here, but I personally felt that the overall animation in both Jim and the other characters was great. Not only this, but the texture quality, lighting effects and overall quirkiness of the worlds really comes across well. And even more surprisingly is that this was without the support of the expansion pack. I assume that this was due to how clunky the development cycle was, but it would have been nice to have seen the expansion pack used to smooth out the overall frame rate here. This is not a game which has many frame rate issues, but there are times with multiple enemies on screen where you'll see things drop sharply, and then this instantly improves when you dispatch a few of the on-screen foes. The weakest area of the game in my opinion, and one which almost ruins the whole package, is just how poor the boss levels are. With some absolutely incredible characters at the studio's disposal, the end of world bosses should have been the icing on the cake, and with how weird and wonderful they are, I was hoping for some epic and challenging battles. The problem is though, the boss levels see you jump on the back of a pig and enter a bizarre one-on-one battle every time. Not only this, but the actual battles themselves do not change. It's the same format, just with a higher difficulty each time. It takes away pretty much all personality from the bosses and limits them to a wacky hovercraft from Diddy Kong Racing style battle. The controls in the bosses are terrible, and the formula is so basic that it shouldn't have been anything more than a mid-level minigame, never mind the climax of hours of working through the game. This was poor, very poor, and quite honestly inexcusable. I tend to prefer finishing on a high, and thankfully the game's audio department is on par with its visuals. The score is just as quirky as the storyline, and I almost felt a Simpsons-esque style ring in my ears whenever it played. It's definitely not a soundtrack that you could listen to from start to finish without getting a headache from such an eclectic mix of styles, but each piece on its own works very well and it fits in perfectly. The tunes are as catchy as hell. The audio effects too are all presented with a well-rounded and clear audio. The blasts of your weapon sound perfect, and the screams and yells of the characters help to bring the overall experience to life. I would have loved to have heard a whole ton more of the voice acting to help deliver the story and when Jim interacts with characters. But alas, what we were left with here is good, but we're all well versed in the limitations of the cart-based format, and sadly they are completely evident here. Earthworm Jim 3D is a tricky game to form an opinion of. The first two games in the series were what I would consider modern day classics, and yet Earthworm Jim 3D doesn't really do much wrong, but it doesn't push the boundaries in the same way its predecessors did. As much as I enjoyed the overall game, I can't help but feel it will be a long time before I'd return to play this one, because there's just so many better other options on the system. However, if you found every collectible in Donkey Kong 64, and if you've gained every star in Super Mario 64 for the 100th time, then Earthworm Jim 3D could be the forgotten N64 platform game that you've been looking for. It's not a perfect game, nor is it a hidden gem. But if you detach your love for the first two prequels and embrace this game for what it tries to be, then you may find that this is a game you'll enjoy far more than you were actually expecting to. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what your favourite game was that nearly became vaporware, but thankfully managed to get back on track and find a release date. From reading comments all the time on this channel, I know a lot of you get a kick about hearing from a game's development cycle and problems that happened. And so with your comment, also share your knowledge about why your favourite game was having trouble. I'd also like to know what you would do to bring Earthworm Jim back into the gaming spotlight. I would personally love to see a 2D Metroidvania style Earthworm Jim game, perhaps with a cel shaded art style for something truly fresh. Of course, a kart style racer would be pretty awesome too, taking control of Psychro in races. But as always, let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments section down below, and until next time.